The wind died at 4 in the afternoon, and by 6, the sable wren sat upon a sea so flat and so silent that Beatrix Fairfax could hear her own heartbeat in the rigging above her head. She stood at the rail in the failing light, and beside her, closer than propriety allowed and farther than her pride wished, stood the Duke of Kestrelmere, watching the horizon as though it had personally offended him. "It will not return before morning," he said. "The men say a becalming like this can hold 3 days, sometimes more, this far from the coast." "Then we are prisoners of the weather, Your Grace, same as we were prisoners of my brother's debts 3 weeks ago." He turned his head at that, amber eyes catching the last violet light, and something in his face, not quite a smile, never quite a smile with him, loosened by a fraction. "I had not thought you the sort of woman to speak so plainly of her own ruin." "I had not thought you the sort of man who would notice if I did." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, which surprised her more than anything else about the last 3 weeks. She had grown accustomed, in London, to silences that pressed and accused, that waited for her to fill them with apology for existing in reduced circumstances. This one simply was, unhurried as the sea itself, and she found she did not mind it. 3 weeks earlier, in a ballroom in Falmouth blazing with candlelight and cruelty, Beatrix had been informed by her betrothed, Mr. Edmund Cray, in front of 40 witnesses, that he had found a bride with £40,000 and no brother drowning in gaming debts, and that she ought to understand a man's obligations. He had said it lightly, almost kindly, as though he were doing her a mercy by explaining it in company rather than in private, where she might have argued. She had not wept. She had not raised her voice. She had set down her champagne glass, thanked her hostess for a lovely evening, and walked out into the night with her spine a rod of iron. And it was only when she reached the street that her hands began to shake, badly enough that she had to press them flat against the cold stone of the townhouse wall to still them. What no one in that ballroom yet understood, what Beatrix herself would not understand for some weeks yet, was that she was not being watched by only her tormentor and his laughing circle of friends. Julian Thorne, Duke of Kestrelmere, had stood near the door for the whole of the exchange, a glass of unwanted champagne in his hand, and had watched a woman absorb a public humiliation without giving her audience the satisfaction of a single tear. He recognized something in the particular stillness of her spine. He had worn that same stillness himself once, in a different ballroom, a different decade, and he knew precisely what it cost. He followed her out, not urgently, not in a manner that would draw attention, simply the unhurried departure of a duke who had decided the evening had grown tiresome, and found her in the street with the rain just beginning, her carriage not yet called, her composure holding by threads he could see even in the dark. He said nothing of what he had witnessed inside. He offered no false comfort, no performance of sympathy she had not asked for. "You will not stand in that street a moment longer than necessary," he said, and handed her into his own carriage, and gave the direction to her lodgings himself, and rode the whole distance in a silence she came to understand later as its own kind of gift. He asked nothing of her. He required no gratitude, no explanation, no performance of the composure she was fighting so hard to maintain. He simply saw her home, and at her door he said only, "Good night, Miss Fairfax," and was gone before she had gathered herself enough to properly thank him. It was 3 days before he called again, this time in daylight, with a proposal so unexpected that she made him repeat it twice. "My aunt requires a companion for the season at Kestrelmere Hall," he said. "She is unwell and difficult, and will test the patience of any woman not already accustomed to difficult company. I understand you have recently developed a considerable tolerance for difficult company." "You are offering me employment, Your Grace." "I am offering you an escape from Falmouth, which I suspect you require rather more urgently than employment, though the position is a genuine one, and the wages are fair. My aunt genuinely does require a companion. I am not inventing a post to rescue you, Miss Fairfax. I have too much respect for your pride to insult it that way. I am simply pointing out that the post exists, and that you are, in my observation, entirely suited to it." What he did not say, not yet, not for some weeks, was that he had his own account to settle with Edmund Grey's family. A debt of humiliation 11 years old, inherited from a night at Almack's when Julian was a green young heir new to his title, and Grey's father had made a public fool of him in front of the same glittering world that had just watched Beatrix be discarded by the sun. The particular cruelty ran in the family, it seemed, generation to generation, and Julian recognized it because he had carried the mark of it himself for over a decade. She said yes to the post before he had finished explaining the terms, and if some part of her understood, even then, that a duke did not generally deliver employment offers to jilted young women in person and unannounced, she chose not to examine that understanding too closely. Pride, she was learning, could be a fortress, or it could be a prison, and she was tired of living in the second kind. The journey to Cornwall was meant to take 4 days by ship, the sable wren carrying the duke's household, his ailing aunt, 2 maids, Beatrix, and Julian himself, who had business at Kestrel-near Hall that could not wait for the London season's end. The wind held fair for the first day and a half. Then, somewhere past the Lizard, with the Cornish coast still a smudge on the horizon, it simply stopped, all at once, as though the sky itself had exhaled and had nothing left to give. 3 days, the captain reported grimly, reading whatever weather signs sailors read in flat water and empty sky. Perhaps 4, Your Grace. There is nothing to be done but wait. It was on that first becalmed evening that Beatrix found Julian at the rail, and the conversation that unsettled her composure more thoroughly than a fortnight of London gossip ever had. "Tell me," she said, when the silence had stretched long enough to be its own kind of conversation. "What he said to you. Grey's father. You mentioned once, in passing, that there was history between your families, and you have never told me the particulars. Only that there were particulars." "You are direct, Miss Fairfax." "You rescued me from a street in the rain, Your Grace, and gave me honest employment when you might have simply let me drown in my own ruin, as everyone else in Falmouth seemed content to do. I think directness is the least I owe you." He was quiet long enough that she thought he would decline her, as he had declined every gentle inquiry into himself for the 3 weeks she had known him, turning conversations with a practiced ease that she had, until tonight, mistaken for simple reserve rather than the armor it actually was. But the ship rocked, gentle and directionless, and perhaps it was the strangeness of a becalmed sea, no destination, no urgency, nothing but water and sky and each other, that loosened something in him that London never had. "He announced my engagement before I had proposed," Julian said at last, his voice carefully level, the voice of a man reciting something he had rehearsed alone many times, but rarely spoken aloud. "To a young woman I had shown polite attention, and nothing more, in front of the whole room, as a jest, because he found it amusing to watch me stammer and deny it, and look, in front of every person whose good opinion I required, like a boy who did not yet know his own mind. I was newly a duke. My father had died 4 months prior, of an apoplexy, at his own dinner table, and I had inherited a title I was not remotely prepared to hold. I had not yet learned how to command a room, and Grey's father knew it, and he used it, because cruelty amused him, and my youth made it easy." "And the young woman, what became of her?" "Married someone else within the year, quite happily, and bore him no ill will that I am aware of. The joke, such as it was, cost her nothing. The harm was mine. And it was small, in the grand accounting of harms. A boy embarrassed at a dance, nothing that would trouble a wiser man's sleep. But I have never forgotten the particular helplessness of being laughed at by people who mistake laughter for wit, who require nothing of themselves and everything of the person they have chosen to diminish. I resolved, that night, walking home alone because I could not bear a carriage full of witnesses to my own humiliation, that no one would ever again see enough of me to laugh. "And so you became this." She gestured, not unkindly, at the whole controlled architecture of him, the still hands folded on the rail, the measured voice, the eyes that gave away nothing until, unaccountably, they had begun giving away everything to her. "And so I became this," he agreed. 11 years of it. A man who is universally described as composed, which I have come to understand is simply a more flattering word for afraid. Until a woman set down a champagne glass in a Falmouth ballroom and walked out into the rain as though her spine were made of something finer than the rest of us. And I found I could not stop thinking of her composure, could not stop turning it over, trying to determine whether what I felt watching her was admiration or something considerably more inconvenient. Beatrix's breath caught, and she was glad of the darkness gathering over the still water, glad he could not quite see her face in it. "Which conclusion have you reached, Your Grace?" "The inconvenient one. I reached it approximately a week into your employment, and have been in a foul temper about it ever since, which my staff will confirm if you ask them. My valet in particular has remarked upon it twice, with a degree of insolence I have chosen not to correct, because he is not entirely wrong." She laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, the first since the ballroom, and he watched her do it with an expression she had not yet seen on him, something unguarded and almost young, the 11 years falling briefly away from his face like a coat shrugged off in an overheated room. The becalming held through the next day. There was nowhere for either of them to be but in each other's company, no London obligations to retreat behind, no ballrooms to perform composure in, no watching crowd to require anything of either of them. They walked the deck at dawn when the crew scrubbed the boards, the salt air sharp and clean in a way London's air never was. He taught her the names of the rigging, the mizzen, the mainstay, the running lines she had never had occasion to learn, with the patient thoroughness of a man who found genuine satisfaction in explaining things properly. She taught him, without meaning to, without any deliberate lesson at all, that a man could be looked at plainly and not flinch from it, that stillness need not always be armor. They took their meals together in the small cabin his aunt had claimed too seasick to leave her berth for, the elderly Lady Ravensdale dozing through most of their conversations, a chaperone in name only, occasionally rousing to demand weak tea and deliver some tart observation about the younger generation's manners before subsiding again into her pillows. Beatrix came to be genuinely fond of her, even in her half-sleeping state, and suspected the old woman was rather more aware of the currents running beneath the cabin's polite conversation than she let on. "You watch him," Lady Ravensdale said once, without opening her eyes, startling Beatrix badly enough that she nearly spilled her tea. "My nephew. You watch him the way a woman watches a door she is not certain will open." "I am his aunt's companion, my lady. I watch him because he is my employer's nephew, and it would be strange not to notice him at all." Said Lady Ravensdale, and said nothing further, but the corner of her mouth had curved in a way that suggested she was not remotely deceived. On the second becalmed night, with the stars close and enormous over a sea like poured glass, Beatrix found Julian at the rail again, and this time she did not wait for him to speak first. "You said that first evening that Cray's father wounded you. I wonder, did you ever consider a reckoning, some manner of answering it?" "I considered it for years. I am considering something of the sort even now, in fact, regarding the son, though I had not intended to burden you with the particulars of my scheming." "Regarding Edmund? What manner of reckoning?" He was quiet a moment, choosing his words with evident care. "I had thought, when I offered you the post at Kestrelmere, that I might also arrange for certain irregularities in Cray's gaming accounts to reach the attention of his new betrothed's family before the wedding proceeded. It would not be difficult. I have connections at several of the clubs he frequents, and men in his position rarely manage their debts with the discretion they imagine. I confess I thought it might please you to see him exposed as he exposed you. And now? Now I find I have grown considerably less interested in his ruin than I was 3 weeks ago, and I am trying to determine what has changed, though I suspect you already know the answer better than I do." Beatrix considered this, the ship rocking gentle and slow beneath them, no wind to hurry either of them toward anything, no destination pressing at their backs. "I have thought of little else these 3 weeks myself. Imagined him humiliated as I was humiliated. Imagined the satisfaction of watching him understand what it felt like. But I find, tonight, standing here, that I no longer particularly want it. No. I find I would rather have this. Whatever this is. I would rather have 3 days of dead wind and honest conversation than a lifetime of engineered revenge, Your Grace. If I am permitted to say something so unguarded to a duke. You are permitted, he said, to say anything you like to this particular duke. I find I have grown remarkably fond of your unguarded moments. I've had rather few of my own in 11 years, and yours have begun to feel like borrowed courage, as though simply standing near you teaches me something about honesty I had forgotten how to practice. Is that what this is? Borrowed courage? I think, he said, and here his composure did, finally, crack. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture, but in the small, honest way a man's voice changes when he has decided to stop protecting himself. That I have not spoken to anyone the way I speak to you. Not since I was a boy who had not yet learned that a title requires a mask. I do not know how to say this without it sounding like the flattery I despise in other men. But you are the first person in 11 years I have not felt the need to perform for. I would not know how to accept flattery from you. You have never once offered me any. In 3 weeks. No, I have offered you the truth, which I understand is considerably rarer among dukes, and considerably less comfortable to receive. She turned to face him fully then, the ship rocking gentle and slow beneath them, no wind to hurry either of them toward anything. Then give me more of it. I am afraid of you, he said simply. I have commanded a household, a title, and 11 years of unassailable composure, and I have discovered that a woman with a shaking hand and an iron spine can undo the whole architecture of it in 3 weeks at sea. I do not know what to do with that fear, except to tell you of it plainly, because I find I would rather be honest and afraid than composed and alone. And I have been composed and alone for a very long time, Miss Fairfax. There are declarations made in ballrooms, loud and public and calculated for effect. And there are declarations made at sea, in the dead of a windless night, quiet enough that only the water hears them first. Beatrix would think for the rest of her life that she had been fortunate enough to receive the second kind. I am not afraid of you, she said. I have found, these 3 days, that you are the only thing in my present circumstance that does not frighten me at all. Not my brother's deaths, not Edmund's cruelty, not the prospect of a life spent as someone's companion. None of it frightens me the way it did a month ago, and I believe you are the reason. He reached for her hand, not a grand gesture, nothing performed for any audience, because there was none to perform for, only stars and still water and a ship going nowhere. And she let him take it, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything further, because nothing further needed saying. The third becalmed day brought a change in the aunt's condition. Not dangerous, the ship's surgeon assured them. Merely the ordinary discomfort of prolonged seasickness aggravated by the heat and stillness of the windless air. But it required attention, and Beatrix spent the better part of the day at Lady Ravensdale's bedside, applying cool cloths and reading aloud from a battered volume of sermons the old woman claimed to despise and requested constantly nonetheless. Julian found her there in the late afternoon, having exhausted whatever ship's business a becalmed duke could occupy himself with, and stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment before she noticed him. She is sleeping now, Beatrix said quietly, setting the book aside. The surgeon says she will mend once we have wind again and can reach a proper bed. You have been at this all day. She is difficult, as you promised, but she is also rather wonderful in her way. I find I do not mind difficult company nearly so much as I once feared I would. I have watched you tend her with a patience I do not entirely deserve to witness, Julian said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before, a rawness beneath the careful cadence. I offered you a post as a companion because I told myself it was the honest thing to do, the respectable thing, a genuine position rather than an insult to your pride. But I think, if I am to continue this practice of unguarded honesty you have taught me, I must admit I offered it because I could not bear the thought of you leaving Falmouth and never seeing you again. And a duke does not get to say such things to a woman 3 weeks acquainted, not with any decency, so I dressed it as employment instead. Julian. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both seemed to hear the shift in it, the door it opened. Beatrix. He said it back to her like a question he was not yet certain he had permission to ask. I accepted the post, she said, because Lady Ravensdale genuinely required a companion, and because the wages were fair, and because I could not remain in Falmouth a moment longer without losing whatever remained of my composure. Those were true reasons. But I think, if we are being honest with one another at last, that I also accepted because you had not once, in the whole course of offering it, looked at me the way Falmouth looked at me, as a cautionary tale, a woman to be pitied or dismissed. You looked at me as though I were still entirely myself, ruin and all, and I did not know how much I needed to be looked at that way, until you did it. There was, however, one further complication before the wind returned, a complication that arrived not with the weather, but with the ship's post, carried aboard by a fishing vessel that had drawn alongside that same third afternoon to trade fresh catch for tobacco and, incidentally, to deliver a small packet of letters that had been waiting at the last port of call. Among them was a letter for Julian, sealed with a hand Beatrix did not recognize, but which visibly darkened his expression the moment he broke the wax. What is it? She asked, watching him read it twice through. His jaw tightening in the particular way she had learned, over 3 weeks, meant he was suppressing some strong feeling, rather than absent one. Cray's father, he said finally. The old humiliation's author. He has written to inform me that he has heard, through some channel or other, of my aunt's companion accompanying my household to Cornwall, and to suggest, in language considerably more oblique than I am about to render it, but no less pointed for the oblique phrasing, that a duke who allows himself to be seen showing particular attention to a penniless companion, one moreover jilted by his own son for want of fortune, risks becoming rather a greater joke than the one he made of me 11 years ago. Beatrix felt the colour leave her face. He knows, then, about Edmund, about me. Falmouth is not so large a town as either of us would wish, and gossip travels faster than ships. Julian folded the letter with a precision that suggested considerable effort at self-command. He goes on to remind me that my grandmother's connections expect a match befitting the title, an heiress, a peer's daughter, someone whose fortune might restore what 3 generations of indifferent stewardship have somewhat diminished. He is not wrong about the state of the estate accounts, more's the pity. He is entirely wrong about everything else, but the accounts, unfortunately, are real. Then perhaps he is not entirely wrong to write it. Beatrix heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt, the old Falmouth composure reasserting itself out of long habit. You are a duke with an estate to maintain, Your Grace, and I am precisely the sort of penniless complication his letter describes. I would not wish to be the ruin of a second man's prospects in the space of a single month. Do not, Julian said, and there was an edge in it she had not heard from him before, sharp and immediate. Do not retreat behind that composure with me. Not here. Not after everything we have said to one another on this ship. I have spent 11 years being told what a duke owes his name, his grandmother's connections, and his father's memory. I know the calculation better than Cray's father does, believe me. I have run it in my own head 1,000 times these 3 days, lying awake, turning over the state of the tenant farms and the roof at Kestrelmere Hall that wants mending, and the very real fact that an heiress would solve problems that you cannot solve, not with fortune, whatever else you might bring to a marriage. Then he is correct. He is correct about the accounts, and entirely, catastrophically wrong about what I intend to do about them. I did not survive 11 years of being told my worth by other men's calculations in order to hand my own happiness over to my enemy's father, simply because his arithmetic happens to be sound. I will mend the roof some other way. I will find an heiress's fortune in better land management and less indulgent tenants. Or I will simply have a colder hall and a warmer marriage. And I find, turning it over these 3 days, that I have already made my choice and merely required his letter to make me say it aloud. You cannot decide such a thing in anger, on a becalmed ship, 3 days from anywhere that matters. I am not deciding it in anger. I am deciding it in the clearest headed state I have enjoyed in 11 years, which is rather the point I am attempting to make, if you would permit me to make it without arguing me out of my own happiness on my behalf. He softened then, seeing something in her face that gave him pause. Beatrix, look at me. I am not asking you to solve the roof. I am telling you that I have weighed the roof against you and found the roof wanting. And I would like, very much, for you to stop weighing yourself against it on my behalf, because you have already lost that argument before you have finished making it. I have made up my mind, and I am considerably more stubborn than my accounts. She did not answer him at once. She stood at the rail with the letter's implications settling over her like the windless air itself, and thought of Falmouth, and of Edmund's careless cruelty, and of how easily a man's calculations could be dressed up as obligation and handed to a woman as though she ought to be grateful for the honesty of it. And she thought, too, of 3 days spent watching Julian Thorne set aside 11 years of careful architecture, simply because a becalmed sea had given them nowhere else to be but honest with one another. Your grandmother's connections will not approve of me, she said at last. My grandmother's connections did not approve of my father's marriage either, as it happens, and my parents managed 40 years of genuine devotion regardless, roof troubles and all. I find I am not overly concerned with connections who require a woman's fortune before they will require her character. It was not, in the end, a grand resolution. No letter burned dramatically over the rail, no declaration shouted into the dying wind. It was simply Julian folding Cray's father's letter into his coat, unanswered, and offering Beatrix his arm for the walk back to the cabin, where his aunt would soon wake and want her tea, and Beatrix taking it, and the two of them understanding, without further discussion, that the matter had been settled between them and required no audience to make it real. The wind returned on the 4th morning, sudden and generous, filling the sails with a great exhalation that sent the crew scrambling, and the Sable Wren surging forward at last toward Cornwall. Beatrix stood at the rail and felt the ship come alive beneath her feet, the deck tilting into proper motion after 3 days of eerie stillness. And beside her, Julian Thorne watched the horizon with an expression she had come to recognize. Not coldness, never truly coldness. Only a man learning, slowly and against 11 years of habit, how to be looked at. They reached Kestrel-Near Hall 2 days later, the grey stone rising up from the Cornish cliffs with a severity that Beatrix found, to her own surprise, rather beautiful. Gulls wheeling above the towers, the sea crashing against rock far below the gardens, the whole estate smelling of salt and heather and something older than either. If the household staff noticed that their duke had returned from a becalmed voyage, a different man than the one who had departed, quicker to smile, slower to retreat behind formality, prone to seeking out his aunt's companion with a frequency that had rather less to do with his aunt's comfort than propriety strictly required. None of them remarked upon it aloud, though several exchanged significant glances below stairs, and the housekeeper was overheard to remark to the cook that she had not seen his grace laugh so freely since before the old duke's death. The reckoning Julian had proposed in Falmouth never came to pass, not as either of them had originally imagined it. There was no engineered humiliation, no public unmasking of the man who had jilted her, no letters delivered to gaming clubs or whispered warnings to unsuspecting brides. Word reached them at Kestrel-Near some months later, carried in a letter from a Falmouth acquaintance, that Edmund Cray's £40,000 bride had discovered certain irregularities in his gaming accounts, entirely on her own, without any intervention from Cornwall, and had withdrawn from the engagement herself, with considerably less ceremony than he had shown Beatrix, and considerably more devastating effect upon his prospects among the families who mattered to him. Beatrix received this news with a composure that would have satisfied even the harshest critic of her character, and felt, to her genuine surprise, almost nothing at all. The reversal had happened without either of them lifting a finger, his own cruelty and carelessness undoing him in the end, far more thoroughly than any scheme of theirs could have managed. And she found she did not need it the way she once believed she had. What she needed, she had found instead on a becalmed sea with dead wind and an honest duke. And needed still, months later, when Julian Thorne asked her, at the same rail where he had first admitted his fear of her, aboard the same ship, on a calm evening chosen with great deliberation to be nothing like the ballroom that had once tried to break her, whether she would consent to be his duchess. "I should point out," she said, laughing despite the enormity of the moment, "that you have never once flattered me in the whole course of our acquaintance, Your Grace, and I begin to suspect it is a deliberate policy." "I do not intend to begin now, and it is entirely deliberate. I intend only to tell you that I have not felt the need to perform for anyone since a windless night 3 days out from Falmouth, and I find I have no wish to begin performing again, not even for my own proposal. Marry me, Beatrix, because I am tired of composure, and have discovered I much prefer honesty, and you are the only person alive who has ever required it of me, and I do not believe I could bear to spend the rest of my life being merely composed again, not after knowing the alternative." She said yes, the way she had said everything of consequence to him since that first becalmed evening, plainly, without ceremony, her spine still a rod of iron, and her hand, this time, entirely steady in his. They were married that autumn at Kestrelmere Hall, in a ceremony considerably smaller and warmer than the ton expected of a duke, attended by Lady Ravensdale in a chair by the fire, who declared the whole affair a great deal of sentiment for one afternoon, but was observed to weep openly during the vows regardless. Edmund Cray was not invited, and would not have been welcomed had he presumed to arrive uninvited, though by then his own diminished circumstances had reduced him to an obscurity thorough enough that no one in attendance thought of him at all, his cruelty having cost him, in the end, considerably more than it had ever cost her. Years later, when their eldest daughter asked how her parents had come to marry, expecting some grand tale of ballrooms and courtship such as filled the novels she loved, Beatrix would tell her only that the wind had died at 4 o'clock one afternoon in the Channel, and that sometimes the truest conversations a person ever has are the ones that happen when there is nowhere left to hurry toward, and nothing left to perform. Her daughter, who had inherited her mother's directness and her father's amber eyes, and, most of all, her father's habit of falling entirely silent before saying something that mattered, thought this a strange sort of love story, until she was old enough to understand that the best ones very often are. The Duke of Kestrelmere, in his later years, was known among the ton as a man of unusual warmth for his rank, approachable where his contemporaries remained remote, generous where custom favoured reserve, quick to laugh in a way that startled acquaintances who remembered the colder young duke of a decade past. Those who had known him in his younger, guarded years scarcely recognized the change in him, though none of them ever learned its cause, and Julian never troubled himself to explain it to anyone who had not earned the explanation. Only Beatrix knew that the cause had been a dead wind, a still sea, and 3 days in which a duke had finally been permitted to stop performing and simply be looked at, plainly, by someone who had decided not to flinch, and that the reckoning he had once planned so carefully had mattered, in the end, far less than the honesty he had never planned for at all.